Hi, I'm Kristen from Montavilla Sewing Center, and today we're going to make a classic tote bag. It's got fun handles, lining, a nice corner detail, and it's pretty straightforward and simple to make. We're going to put a PDF of the instructions down below, link that, and I'm going to show you all the steps to make your very own classic tote bag. Groceries, books, whatever. Okay, to start, you're going to need your cutting mat, your rotary cutting ruler, your rotary cutter, some pins, and some marking tools. I've got a chalk marker for dark fabrics and a friction pen for light fabrics. Choose what works best for you. You'll need a ½ yard of your main fabric cut to 18 inches wide by 36 inches long. If your fabric is directional like ours, since this is going to be the front and the back of your tote, you don't want your swans or whatever your motif is to be upside down. So cut, if you have directional fabric, cut this 36 3/4 inches long, and then you're going to cut it crosswise down the middle. Like that. And now you can rotate 1/2, and then you'll sew these two together with a 3/8 inch seam. Here's our piece sewn together, and eventually when the tote bag is done, you see the one side and the other side both have the motif facing up. Optionally, you can use a piece of interfacing cut to 18 inches by 36 inches if you want a little more stability for your project. And you'll iron that onto the back of your main fabric if you're using it. You need 1/3 yard of your base fabric, and that you're going to cut to 18 inches by 12 inches. You need 3/4 yard of your lining fabric, and you're going to cut that into 18 inches by 36 inches and 2 width of fabric by 4.5 inch strips. These are going to be your handles. Here's my main fabric. I have ironed my optional interfacing to the back side of it. This one is directional, so I also have that center seam, which I did before I added the interfacing. For each of your handle strips, you're going to press the strip in half lengthwise, open it up, and then press towards that center crease, and then press again. This is going to give you a nice sturdy handle, and you don't have to try to turn any long tubes inside out or right side out. So now that we've done that, we're going to go to the sewing machine, and we're going to top stitch this edge closed and top stitch this edge just to make it look good. For top stitching, you're just going to stitch close to each edge here. And I have a favorite trick, which is to use the edge stitch foot. It comes in a couple of different names and different brands. They look a little different. For this machine, we've got a little blade, plastic blade here that you can move back and forth. And I've got it, if my needle is going to be in the center point here, just not quite at 1/16, maybe 1/8 of an inch to the right of where the needle is going to be. So on some machines, it's a blade that's down the middle of the foot, and you will move your needle to the left or to the right. So I'm going to put on this foot. And on this one, when I'm going to align the edge of my fabric with that little plastic guide, and then I can sew right along the edge, and it makes that edge, that stitching along the edge, super consistent, super tidy. I love it. I'll show you right there how consistent that is. So now I'm going to finish top stitching the handles. And I'm going to do the same thing to the other side, just so it looks the same. All right, let's get to the next step. Okay, so once we've sewn our handles, we can go back to our cutting area and get our main fabric. If your main fabric was one piece, fold it in half this way and iron it so you have a crease down the center. Ours has a seam line down the center, so I'm going to use that as my guide. And you're going to mark a line 5 inches to one side of that center line and 5 inches to the other. So my ruler is 6 inches, so that's 5 right there. There we go. Then you're going to find the center mark of each line and mark 3 inches to either side. So 9 inches is the center, and I'm going to go 1, 2, 3 inches to that side, and 1, 2, 3 inches to that side, and do the same on my other line. 9 inches, 1, 2, 3, and 1, 2, 3. This is where I'm going to line up my straps. So there's one strap, and I'm going to pin the inner edge of the strap right here to the outside of that mark that I made. And I'm going to use a pin. And you're going to want the end of your strap to be at least 1/4 inch, if not a little bit longer, towards the center from that line. Then you're going to bring it up and around. There we go. And notice that I did not twist this. So there's my mark. And I'm going to pin. Now I want to make sure that my handles are straight, so I'm going to use my ruler again. And just make sure that from wherever this is, I get a nice straight line. And I'm also going to go ahead and place my pin 1 inch down from the edge of the fabric, because this is where we're gonna sew our handles here, and we're gonna stop short of that top edge. Okay, I'm going to do the same on the other end, or other side. Okay, and I'm going to make sure this is nice and straight again. Okay. All right, now we're going to go back over to the sewing machine and we're going to sew. You can either follow that top stitch line that you did, and go across and back down again, or stitch next, just inside of it. Okay, back to the sewing machine. So I switched back to my standard zigzag foot. I'm not using the edge stitch foot anymore. But I am going to use that edge stitching as a guide. So I'm going to start at the raw edge of my strap. Take out that first pin. I suppose I could still use that edge stitch foot. It would be very nice for this portion of sewing on the strap. The only trick is when I get up to the top here, now I have to pivot. When you're pivoting, make sure your needle is down. You can lift the presser foot. Look at that. Stitch to the other side. Make sure your presser foot is down. This is where it's nice to have a sewing machine with the needle up, needle down function, because your needle just always ends exactly where you want it to be. You just end there, and you're going to do this for all 4 strap ends. All right, we've got our handles sewn on now, and so the next step is to add our base. And this is serves 2 purposes. 1, it's decorative. 2, it's going to cover up our raw edges here. You're going to take your piece of base fabric that you've cut 18 inches long by 12 inches and press under about 1/4 inch on each side. Then you're going to center this, lining it up with those lines that you made. Maybe. Actually, it extends those lines a little bit, but I've got it centered over the ends of my straps, centered on my main fabric, and I'm going to pin it in place. And then once it's pinned, I'll go back over to the sewing machine and I'm going to top stitch right along here on this side and on this side. I can use that edge stitch foot again. I can use the edge of the presser foot as a guide. Maybe I even want to do some fancy stitches. That could be kind of fun. Okay, so I just top stitched my tote bag base. Everything's all nice and sewn together. Everything's staying in place. Now comes the kind of sort of tricky part. Maybe we shouldn't call it tricky, we should call it magic. We are going to sew up the sides, but we're going to do it in a way that's going to give us a really interesting, fun, folded detail on the outside of the bag. So what you're going to do is you're going to fold the bag in half, right sides out. This is the not very intuitive part. So fold it right sides out in half. And you're going to measure 2.5 inches up from the fold. So 1, 2.5 inches, and put a pin at that mark. You're going to do that on both sides. So 1, 2 1/2, and put a pin. And you're going to make sure that the pins go through all the layers. Now, you're going to fold your tote back to where the pins are holding it. And you're going to fold both the front and the back, both sides. And now we can match up the top edge of the tote. And obviously you're going to match your sides here. And you're going to pin this in place. You're going to kind of flatten everything out, put a couple of pins in just to hold everything together. You'll do that on both sides of the bag. And you see, you've got everything folded up here. Just like that. And do the same thing on the other side. I'm going to sew up my side seams now. I'm going to use a 3/8 inch seam allowance. That's usually about the width of your presser foot or the first mark on your stitch plate. So that's just an easy one to find. I'm going to do a little back stitch at each end too, just for extra security. This gets a little thick, but your machine should be able to handle it. And, whoops. Back stitch, push the wrong button. There we go. And we'll do the same on the other side. Okay, now we've made the outside of our tote bag. We're gonna turn it right sides out. And look at that fancy corner you just did. So now we're gonna set this aside and make our lining and then come back and put the two parts together. But it's starting to look pretty good. I've got my lining fabric. It's cut to 18 by 36. I'm going to fold it in half, and I'm going to sew the sides that were the long sides. Sew it together with a 3/8 inch seam allowance on either side. Okay, there's my fold. We're going to sew the other side. Okay, now we're going to go to the cutting table and box our corners. Okay, so I've sewn the side seams of my tote lining, and this is the fold, the bottom fold down there, and here is the top opening. So to box these corners down here, I'm going to get my ruler out, and I am going to draw a square that is 2.5 inches from the seam, from that thread stitched line, not the edge, but the stitched line, and from the folded line. So 2.5. So that's 1, 2.5 there to the stitching, and 1, 2.5 to the fold. And I'm going to mark that, and I'm going to do the same on the other bottom corner. And then I'm going to cut right on those lines. And then here comes another little bit of magic. When I pick this up and I pull it out by the corners of the little squares, everything lines up. My center bottom crease and my side seam should line up. I'm going to put a pin in there. And then I'm going to go to the sewing machine and I'm going to sew right across that raw edge and close that opening. I'm going to pin the other side first before I head over to the sewing machine. And I should have pressed this side seam open before we did this. That would make things even easier. All right. So my little corners are now, the corners of the square are now the edges of my opening. So off to the machine to sew right across there on both sides. Here's our bag lining with its beautifully boxed corners. Now we don't have to turn this right side out. What we're going to do is leave it as it is and put our bag outside on the inside. Just tuck it right in there and make sure your handles are out of the way. Just tuck those handles in, and then you're going to line up your side seams and pin those. And then you're going to pin all the way around. Pin now. I'm pinning and the handles are way down inside. Out of the way, we won't accidentally sew them into our top seam. Okay, I'm going to go to the machine and I'm going to sew almost all the way around here, but I'm going to leave somewhere along this perimeter about 4 inches open for turning this right side out. Okay, that's where I started, so I'll stop about there. Okay. Now, we'll turn this right side out through this hole. There we go. All right, so there's the lining, there's the bag. Just kind of shove that in there. Now I'm going to go over to the iron and I'm going to press all of this nice and tidy around the top edge and then come back and top stitch it in place. We're almost done here. I just want to top stitch right along that edge so everything stays in place. I'm going to go ahead and switch back to my edge stitch foot. And there we go. There's my opening right there. I'm just going to stitch that shut with my top stitch. And there we go, classic tote bag with handles, fun lining, and a really nice detail on the corners. Okay, now that you've made your classic tote bag with its lining and fun corner detail, you can add modifications. On this one, we added a fun pocket between the handles. All you need to do this is a piece of contrasting fabric that is 7 inches wide by 14 inches long, fold it in half right sides out, and then set it down on your fabric before you place your handles. And then the handles will sew the pocket in, as will the bottom. Speaking of bottoms, you don't have to use fabric, you can use cork. And with the cork, you don't have to turn under this edge because it won't unravel. You could also use a product called Craftex, which is like a paper that looks kind of like leather. These are really fun. I also added some scraps of cork here on the handles when I was sewing them to the bag, and so the stitching that stitches down the handles stitches down the cork detail. You can also play around with your fabrics. Here, this one isn't a pocket, but just like the pocket, we took an embroidered panel that we made here at the store and tucked it in between the handles. So, fun way to show off some fancy embroidery on your machine. Have fun, make lots of tote bags, and tag us when you do. Thanks.